two friends, okay? Those of you who have no friends might not understand what I'm telling you, but you know, you have more or less the idea. So I link people if they are friends, and usually my friends are friends between themselves. So I have triangles, okay, which not necessarily have any kind of implication. And I can keep doing that. If you want, I can think in a network of acquaintances, people that I know, okay? And I can keep doing that. And if I take a whole country, that will be a really, really big network, okay? And that's more or less our perception of how networks are organized, okay? Now let me ask you the following question. Imagine that I take someone at random, and I take someone else at random, okay? I just plot a small piece of a million people network, okay? So they can be separated by a long distance. And I ask now, if I want to send a message using the network from this person to this person, how many jumps do I have to make on average, okay? Suppose I have a country of 10 million people or 40 million people like here. You might think, okay, let's be optimistic, maybe 1,000, or very optimistic, 200. The answer of that, as probably many of you know, it's 6. It's an average, it's 6 degrees of separation between any two people you can choose. It is strange, isn't it? The reason of that is that actually this picture of the network, which is true, essentially our relationships, social relations, have a local structure with a lot of local architecture. But in fact, imagine that you do the following experiment. This is my social network. This is people that knows each other. And I do the following experiment. I add at random shortcuts into the network, and then I make them to shorten to the original distance, okay? So what happened with my original network, which is geographic, is that this cartography gets, as you can see, deformed, okay? So this small number of shortcuts modify what? Modify a very important property. If at the beginning with my square lattice, I measure the average number of jumps I have to make, it's large, and it's not surprising. Even for this small network, it's about 9, okay? But what happens when I add a very small number of shortcuts, which in fact is a small amount of disorder into my lattice, what happens is that the average length, the average number of jumps I have to make in the network reduce immediately. And the effect is more and more dramatic as I use a large network. So this idea, which was explored by Watts and Strogatz and started this kind of revolution inside complexity, actually says that you can have a network with a lot of local structure that might be optimized locally to interact with neighbors, but if you put a small amount of disorder, you get immediately a very efficient communication system, okay? And that's what we see now in many, many different systems. For example, in the brain. The brain is a very highly optimized system, okay? Not the brain of the politicians, but the normal brain. And there you observe this kind of behavior. The second thing, and that's probably more interesting, what happened with that boring distribution, the Gaussian distribution for the Erdős ranging networks? Is that what we see in reality? It is not. What we see in reality, this is a map of the physical internet, is that most elements in complex networks, computers, but can be species in an ecosystem, or genes in the genome, have just 1, 2, 3, a small amount of connections. And a few of them, just a few of them, have a lot of connections. These are the hubs. Actually, when you move in the internet and search for a document, you navigate in a universe of millions of documents. And for a number of reasons, the process is very efficient. You don't have to sit for days expecting to receive the information. It's very fast. One of the reasons of this efficiency is precisely that these nodes are the key elements that allow information to propagate very easily. And for these networks, they are responsible for the small world architecture. The distribution is very different, so Many, many, many elements have just a few connections, but some of them have a lot of connections, okay? The consequences of that, beyond the fact that this is very efficient networks, and I want to mention that for technology graphs, for example, for software class diagrams, you have this architecture. So most elements have a few connections, but some of them have a lot of connections. Of course, this is not something that you find in the books. The books don't tell if you build software, please build the software with scale-free architecture. This is something that emerges spontaneously. And we have some clues about why is that. And actually, I cannot explain that here, but it's funny to see that somehow the way software engineers create large-scale programs imitates the way evolution tinkers with the genome, for example. And the last thing to say about the general consequences of this architecture. What happened with these systems when I perform perturbations? Okay? For example, what happened if I remove elements at random? What happened, and that was shown by, excuse me, by Barabashi and his colleagues, is that if you remove elements at random, if you mutate genes at random or remove species at random, what happened is that the network maintains its coherence. It's still a small world, it's still very efficient. Actually, these networks are very robust when you make random perturbations. However, what happens if I remove the highly linked elements? The network almost immediately collapses, okay? Meaning that, yes, they are very robust, they are very efficient, but they are very fragile. And so, let's go for 3 examples and the consequences of that. And again, have in mind that our idea is to look at the structure of these networks, the architecture, and how much can we learn about the mechanisms that drive their evolution. I take language. It sounds like strange to take language thinking about networks, but language show a number of very interesting regularities. In particular, when you move to another country, you might have problems to understand what people is saying, but in spite of the differences, there are a number of universal properties. In particular, for example, is this Zipf's law, which means that imagine that you take a book, for example, a long text, and you count how many times every word appears in the text, right? This follows a distribution that is universal. So every language you take in any country, you'll find that a few words which usually have a low semantic content are very, very abundant, okay? Whereas most of the words, this is in log scale, sorry, excuse me. Whereas most of the words are rare. What is the interpretation of this universality? There's been a lot of discussion about that, and actually there's a number of questions about how language emerged, was something that was gradual. Why language is so complex? There's no such a thing as a range of languages of different complexity. Even between humans, language is either very complex or is something else. And what can we learn about that using networks? And what kind of networks can we define? Okay? I'll show you first the most simple network you can define, which has some advantages and some drawbacks. Let's take a long text, okay? You know that within a sentence, words are not organized at random. They have some special relationships that, in the end, are related to grammar and syntax, okay? So now, what I'm going to do is, let's think in a sentence as some organized structure, and thinking word order, okay? 2 words appear together, not because some kind of random relationship, but because they are linked in some special way. So I'm going to think in words as the nodes of a graph, okay? And I'm going to link the words if they appear together. I'm not showing the arrow, but I should show an arrow together in a given order within a sentence, okay? Actually, let me ask you the following question. when you speak, when you construct sentences, you are using syntax, okay? You are using syntax, which is a very complex thing, in an automatic way. And you don't stop for a while thinking about the structure of the sentence. It just comes out very easily, okay? So again, we navigate in a universe of, let's say, we are educated people, I don't know, 100,000 words, which is pretty much a lot. And we find the right words in the right order very easily, okay? Some professional football players use a universe of 100 words, but that's again a different thing. So my question is, how do you manage to do that? And I'm not going to give you an answer, but I'm going to give you some clue of what might be behind that. I can replace my universe of words as a text with a network, okay? And ask myself, what's the architecture of this network? And the architecture turns out to be, again, these so-called scale-free networks, where most elements have one connection and a few elements have a lot of connections, okay? And for example, if I use a very long text, on average, it's just about 3 degrees of separation, 3 jumps they have to do to go from one word to another word. Who is responsible for that? The hubs. Who can be here? So words that have no real semantic content, but are extremely efficient to connect words. Prepositions, for example, is a clear example that allow me to go from a given word to a lot of other words. So it's very easy to navigate in this universe of words. This particular piece this is from the first chapter of a very well-known book. And I guess white whale tells you something. Doesn't? What will happen? You don't read? This is for Moby Dick, okay? As I said, this is a first approximation which can be expanded in a number of ways. For example, and that's a very recent work we did, which I think it's a really interesting piece of stuff. For example, you can also link words using syntax, okay? Remember when you were young, you go to school and you learn how to organize sentences with a syntactic structure, okay? So I can do the following. I can take conversations by little kids, and this is in the web. You can get very, very nice information about how language grows, changes in kids, going through the 2-year critical period where, as you probably know, kids go from something that is just babbling a word to words relating to objects, and then in a short period of time, this reference from word to object becomes a very complex thing, and they master grammar as any one of us, almost. What is the origin of that? How do they do that? Because we don't teach them syntax. We don't tell to them the whole universe of sentences, so they extract the regularities from just a little piece of information. You could link words in a syntactic way, okay? And people has been discussing about that for many, many years. Why children do that? And Chomsky, and particularly his followers, have been defending the idea that it's probably something in the brain that prepares us to learn language very easily. There's no proof of that. There's indirect evidence. We have been looking at that following the growth of the syntactic network for children, okay? Something that has not been done before. Before the 2 years, this network is a tree, and the words either belong to the tree or just totally isolated, okay? And then, this is 1 month before 2 years. 1 month after 2 years, the network has changed dramatically. The network is a small world, it has scale-free architecture, and when you look inside, how is it organized? Grammar has taken the control. And although this is a very recent result, we have been completely unable to generate this network using self-organizing mechanisms, percolation theory, or things like that. Instead, we are pretty much confident that what we are observing here is direct evidence that something in the brain is shaping grammar. Really. My second example goes to Genome. Genome is, of course, a very, very complex system, and these days we are so happy of having a lot of information about genes, how genes interact, and how are they organized. And of course, again, in this talk, I'm just looking at topology. I'm not looking at dynamics. I'm not looking at many, many different layers of complexity, okay? But when you look at Genome, this is a pretty much good example of how things have changed from the old view of a reductionist picture of reality. When I was a student, again, the idea was, look at the genes in detail, okay? And the gene products in detail, and that will give you the clues of everything, okay? But as Philip Ball said pretty well, the genome can represent, as many journalists have been saying in the wrong way, can be said to be the book of the cell in the same way that a dictionary represents any kind of book or a performance. It's a very different thing, okay? Again, in terms of complexity and evolution, we might ask ourselves, is the genome architecture unique? It results from selection. And for example, I just told you that these scale-free networks are very efficient and are fragile, okay? So maybe this has consequences for genome architecture, and we'll discuss that. One possible way of looking at that is analyzing, this movie for some reason is making strange things, but one possibility is analyzing the nanomachines that are responsible for the dynamics of cell behavior, okay, which are the proteins. And I can think in proteins as the nodes of my network, and two nodes are connected if these two proteins interact physically sometime. Proteins usually work in teams, so they cooperate to perform functions, okay? So that's a way of defining a network. And what's the architecture of this network? Well, we don't have yet a complete picture of that, okay? There's thousands and thousands of proteins, for example, in human cells. But we start to have a pretty good picture. This in particular is a piece of the protein-protein interaction map in humans. Is so-called the P53 box, and it's a bunch of proteins. This is my nodes. Again, remember, this means that they interact physically, okay? And these are related to a very important protein, P53, which appears mutated in about 60% of human cancers. This is interesting. It means that if key proteins that have many, many connections fail, something really important fails, okay? Cell order goes down. Instead, we know that many, many genes can be removed from a cell without having a strong phenotypic effect or not effect at all, which means other things that we have to understand yet. So maybe the idea is the genome architecture has been selected in such a way that I have this kind of topology which connects very efficiently things, and on the other hand, if something fails, something mutates, the effect is going to be very small, okay? Only if a hap fails, I'm going to see a problem here. Okay, I'm going to propose you to make the following. Let's make an abstraction of everything, okay? Let's forget about function, and let's try to see if I can generate this architecture using a very, very simple mathematical model, okay? This is a very difficult task, and to decide what is the right thing is not trivial. So let's follow this advice, okay? Let's make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. This is the model, okay? Imagine I have a graph, okay? So it's a mathematical object, right? So these will be my proteins or my genes, okay? And link means that they interact. We know from a long tradition that the leading mechanism that makes genome grow is duplication. When a cell copies itself, from time to time there are mistakes. And one possible mistake is that there's a redundant copy of a gene. So I'm representing this by choosing at random a node and making a copy, which means that this is the new node and I inherit the old copies. Sorry, the old connections, okay? First rule. The second is, this is a redundant copy. Usually, 50% of the redundant genes are lost, okay? They mutate and they are not necessary. But from time to time, something happens. For example, I can lose a connection, which happens with a probability that has been estimated, is very high. So I lose connections. And on the other hand, I can win new connections, okay? Which happens with a probability that is very small. That's the model. So there's no cell structure, no dynamics, almost nothing. My question is, how far can we go from that? And the thing is, if you iterate this model using the alpha and delta parameters that we know, what we came out in the end is a scale-free network with many properties that we observe in the real proteome. Things that I can measure and that are quantitatively almost the same. What does suggest? It suggests that maybe to generate the basic architecture, I don't need to go into natural selection and tune everything. A large amount of the order that I see comes for free, comes from the generative rules, which have mathematical structure. Another thing that we observed was that these networks are modular. I'm not going to give a lot of detail on that, but because I think that Chris Adami is going to talk about that in his talk. Just to mention that we can measure modularity in a number of ways. This is a trivial modular network. This is a module where elements are a lot connected between them, but less with others, okay? And there's a number of ways of representing that, not giving the details, that allow me to plot blocks of elements that belong to modules as these more lighter boxes, okay? Having in mind that I can do that, this is hierarchical clustering, a particular algorithm, I can ask myself, what happened with modularity in my model, okay? The model that has no function. And the question is especially important because we know modularity is a very good thing. Modularity appears in software networks for very good reasons, appears in biology at all scales, and it's good for many reasons because it allows the system to specialize into different functions, because if something fails in a given place, this failure doesn't propagate to other parts, okay? And allows the probability to be really efficient. What I'm showing you here is a map of the modular architecture of the yeast proteome. What you see here, these little boxes, imply that you have groups of proteins that work together, and perhaps not surprisingly, they work together in specific functions. Cell cycle, whatever you want, okay? What happened in the model that I just showed you, which has no functionality at all, is that in spite that there's no functionality, modules emerge for free, meaning that even at that scale, it might happen that evolution, the generative rules that build the network, okay, without any kind of selection for modularity, already give you modularity. It's something that evolution then can exploit, selection can exploit very, very, very efficiently. Just let me mention as a little point here that modularity, scale-free architecture emerges in cellular networks at different scales. Metabolic pathways, this is an old plot of metabolism. And again, Chris Adami is going to talk about that in the closing talk. This modularity shows that, again, evolution has used a number of rules that we can identify. These include what I just told you, which is tinkering, actually, the application and rewiring, but also optimization. So different things that you can look at these networks. And just to mention that, we look at a different kind of network that you can extract by looking at the reactions that happen not inside the cell, but in a planet atmosphere. We explore the architecture of chemical reaction networks in Earth, in Mars, Titan, the giant planets. And we found is that all planets show a very, very boring distribution of reactions, except one. Earth. Earth shows a scale-free architecture, which is modular. And actually, it's very nice, because when you look at the architecture, what you see is that the basic organization, in a number of ways, resembles pretty much metabolism in a cell, as if, globally, it was a living thing. And let me finish with ecological networks. So at a different scale, different level of organization. Once again, when you look at ecology and ecological networks, even if you go to Antarctica, to a desert, to a rainforest, in spite of the differences, there are very strong regularities. Ecological systems are not homogeneous, like a collection of identical beetles in a box, or a field of maize planted by humans. Neither they are completely heterogeneous systems where, like in a museum, you have one or two samples of each species, okay? That, neither of the two possibilities is observed in nature. Well, there's some previous mention of one possible scenario where this worked, okay? You put together a bunch of single copies or two copies of each species inside a ship, and it is said that that can be sustainable. Well, the thing is that when you look in nature, what you see is that in any ecosystem you look around the world, any diverse ecosystem, you see that most species are rare, and a few of them are very common. And that particular law follows a well-defined mathematical rule, okay? So, beyond the differences, there are universal patterns. Why to look at networks? You know, it sounds like it's pretty difficult sometimes to follow a given species and identify everything. So it looks like looking at ecological networks is too much. I'm going to give you an example that I think is very, very nice and illustrative of why that might be important, okay? This is something that happened in a number of places in the world, in particular in Europe, England, and has to be related with controlling ecological dynamics. Maybe some of you remember many, many years ago, when I was a kid, I remember going to the forest, into the forest, and see these rabbits with tumors in the head as a consequence of the introduction of the myxoma virus. In a number of places in the world, rabbits were very, very abundant, and some very clever person decided that maybe we can control that by using a virus. So the myxoma virus was introduced, and in England in particular, as a consequence of this introduction, a species of butterfly disappeared, went extinct, okay? The large blue butterfly.